They dragged him into the van thinking he was just a helpless witness to their crime, a nobody that no one would miss. But they didn't know that by touching a single hair on his head, they had just declared war on the most dangerous man in the underworld. Welcome back to the channel. If you love intense mafia romances, protective alphas, and stories where the villains regret the day they were born, you are in the right place. We are starting a brand new 6-part series today that is going to keep you on the edge of your seat. Before we dive into the chaos, please make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment Mafia Love down below if you want more stories like this. Now, let's get into part 1. Part 1 starts. Rain lashed against the windows of the Gilded Page, the small, antique bookstore nestled in the quietest corner of the city. It was the kind of rain that washed away the grime of the streets, but did nothing to clean the souls of the men who walked them. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, vanilla, and peace. This was Julian's sanctuary. Julian was a beautiful man, though he tried his best to hide it. He wore oversized sweaters that swallowed his slender frame and kept a scarf perpetually wrapped around his neck, even in the summer. He told his customers it was a fashion choice. The truth was far more dangerous. Beneath the wool lay a mating mark, a scar of possession that claimed him as the property and partner of a man whose name made politicians tremble. "We're closing in 5 minutes," Julian called out softly, his voice melodic but firm. He was an Omega, a rare dynamic in this part of the city, and he knew the risks of being alone after dark. The only customer left was a man in a trench coat who had been staring at the same page of a history book for 20 minutes. He didn't look up. Julian felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. His instincts, usually dormant in this safe haven, suddenly flared. He reached under the counter, his fingers brushing the panic button his husband had installed. Lorenzo. Just the thought of his husband calmed him. Lorenzo was likely across the city right now, sitting in a boardroom filled with smoke and men who killed for a living, deciding the fate of shipping routes. To the world, Lorenzo Distinct was the capo dei capi, the boss of bosses. To Julian, he was simply Enzo, the alpha who warmed his cold feet at night and ate his burnt toast without complaint. "Sir," Julian tried again, stepping out from behind the counter. "I really need to lock up." The man in the trench coat finally closed the book. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He turned, and Julian saw the cold, dead look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a customer. It was the look of a predator. "You're Julian," the man said. It wasn't a question. Julian froze. He went by his middle name, Elias, at the shop. No one here knew him as Julian. "I think you have the wrong person. Please leave." "Pretty thing," the man sneered, his gaze dropping to Julian's neck, trying to see past the scarf. "Boss said you were pretty. Said you saw something you shouldn't have last week. That alleyway behind the shop." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. Last Tuesday, he had been taking out the trash. He had seen a black sedan, a man on his knees, a flash of a silencer. He had ducked back inside, locked the doors, and convinced himself he had imagined it. He hadn't told Lorenzo. He never wanted Lorenzo's dark world to bleed into his sunlight. Stupid, Julian thought. I should have told him. "I don't know what you're talking about," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly. He took a step back toward the panic button. "Don't," the man warned, pulling a handgun from his coat. The silencer was already attached. "Hands where I can see them, Omega." The slur hung in the air. Julian slowly raised his hands. "Look, take the cash register. Take the rare editions in the back. They're worth thousands." The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "We don't want money. We want to make sure you don't talk to the cops. My boss, Mr. Vane, he's very particular about loose ends." Vane. Julian knew the name. A mid-level gangster trying to claw his way up, known for being messy and brutal. If Vane knew who Julian actually was, who Julian's husband was, this man would be on his knees begging for mercy right now. But he didn't know. Julian had kept his identity a secret to protect this life, and now it was going to get him killed. "My husband," Julian started, his voice shaking. "If you take me, my husband will look for me." "Let him look," the gunman scoffed. "By the time he finds you, you'll just be a statistic. Now move. Out the back." Julian's mind raced. He needed to trigger the alarm. He needed Lorenzo. He took a subtle step back, his hip bumping the counter. Crash. The front door shattered inward. Not opened, shattered. The gunman spun around, distracted for a split second. Julian didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy brass paperweight from the counter and hurled it. It struck the gunman in the shoulder. The man grunted, his aim going wide as he fired a shot into the ceiling. Julian scrambled for the back exit, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. He burst into the alleyway, the rain instantly soaking him to the bone. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with rain and fear. Call Enzo. Call Enzo. He dialed the number. 1 ring. 2 rings. Julian. Lorenzo's voice was deep, calm, an anchor in the storm. I'm on my way to pick you up. I'm 5 minutes out. Enzo. Julian screamed, abandoning all caution. Help. They're at the shop. They have guns. Who? The single word was terrifying. The warmth vanished from Lorenzo's voice, replaced by something cold and demonic. I don't know. A man sent by Vane. A hand grabbed Julian's hair, yanking him back. He screamed, the phone flying from his hand and skittering across the wet pavement. You little brat. The gunman hissed. He was joined by 2 others now, men who had been waiting in the van. They grabbed Julian's arms, pinning him. No. Let me go. Julian fought, kicking and thrashing. He wasn't a fighter, but he was an Omega protecting his life. He bit down on a hand, covering his mouth, tasting blood. The man swore and backhanded him. The blow dazed him. Stars exploded in his vision. He slumped, his legs giving out. Toss him in the van. Boss wants to interrogate him personally before we dispose of him, one of the men growled. As they dragged him toward the idling black van, Julian's eyes focused on his phone lying in a puddle a few feet away. The screen was still lit. The call was still connected. Enzo, he whispered, though he knew his husband couldn't hear him over the rain and the engine. A black bag was shoved over his head. The world went dark. The sliding door slammed shut, sealing his fate. Scene break, the high rise. Lorenzo Santoro did not panic. Panic was for men who didn't have power. Lorenzo had power. But what he felt in that moment, sitting in the back of his armored Rolls-Royce, was a fear so primal, so violent, it felt like his chest was being ripped open. Step on it, Lorenzo said. His voice was quiet, deadly quiet. Sir, the driver asked, looking in the rearview mirror. I said drive. Lorenzo roared, the alpha command in his voice so potent that the driver flinched physically. The car surged forward, weaving through traffic, running red lights. Lorenzo grabbed his phone. The call had disconnected. He stared at the blank screen, his hand shaking with suppressed rage. Vane. Julian had said Vane. Lorenzo pressed a button on his speed dial. Marco. Boss, his second-in-command answered immediately. Mobilize everyone. The inner circle. The hit squads. Everyone. Sir? What's the target? My husband, Lorenzo said, the words tasting like ash. Someone took Julian. There was a silence on the other end, heavy and horrified. Everyone in the organization knew one rule. You do not touch the Omega. You do not look at the Omega. The Omega is the heart of the beast. If the heart stops, the beast destroys everything. I'm tracking his phone, Marco said, his voice efficient, masking the terror he felt for whoever had been stupid enough to do this. Signal is stationary. The alley behind his shop. Meet me there. And Marco. Yes, boss. Bring the torture kit. The big one. Scene break. The warehouse. Julian woke up to the smell of rust and bleach. His head throbbed where he had been hit. He was tied to a chair, his wrists bound painfully tight behind his back. The blindfold was gone. He blinked against the harsh fluorescent light. He was in a warehouse. Empty, echoing cold. 3 men stood in front of him. The one from the shop, and 2 others who looked like hired muscle. And sitting on a crate, smoking a cigar, was a man in a cheap suit. Vane. So, Vane said, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. This is the witness. He's an Omega boss, the gunman said, rubbing his shoulder where Julian had hit him. Feisty one. Vane stood up and walked over to Julian. He grabbed Julian's chin, forcing him to look up. You saw me, didn't you? Last Tuesday. You saw me put a bullet in that rat's head. Julian stayed silent. He knew the rules of this world. Begging didn't work. Weakness was exploited. He tried to channel Lorenzo. Be cold. Be stone. I didn't see anything, Julian said, his voice steady despite his fear. I just sell books. Liar, Vane said casually and slapped him. Julian's head snapped to the side. The sting brought tears to his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Check him for wires, Vane ordered. Maybe he's a snitch working for the cops. One of the thugs stepped forward. He reached for Julian's coat. Don't touch me. Julian snarled, shrinking back into the chair. The thug ignored him, ripping the coat open. Then he reached for the scarf. No, Julian screamed. The scarf was his protection. It was the only thing hiding his connection to Lorenzo. If they saw the mark, well, maybe that would save him. Or maybe it would make things infinitely worse. If they knew he was the Don's husband, they might use him as leverage. The thug yanked the scarf away. Silence fell over the warehouse. There, on the junction of Julian's neck and shoulder, was the mark. It wasn't a simple bite. It was a scar that had healed into a symbol of absolute claim. And around it, tattooed in elegant dark ink, was the crest of the Santoro family. A serpent eating a crown. The thug stumbled back as if he had been burned. "Boss." Vane squinted, leaning in closer. Then, his face drained of all color. The cigar fell from his mouth, sizzling on the concrete floor. "That's—" Vane's voice cracked. "That's the Santoro crest." Julian lifted his chin, his eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous confidence. The secret was out. "You didn't just kidnap a witness, Vane. You kidnapped Lorenzo Santoro's husband." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The men looked at each other. They knew who Lorenzo Santoro was. Everyone did. He was the devil. He was the man who had skinned a rival alive for insulting his mother. And they had just pistol-whipped his husband. We have to let him go," one of the thugs stammered, backing away toward the door. "Maybe if we drop him off, apologize." "Idiot," Vane screamed, sweat beading on his forehead. "You think Santoro accepts apologies? If he finds out we touched him, we're dead." Slowly, Vane began to pace, his eyes manic. "There's only one way out. We finish it. We kill him, dump the body in the acid vat. No body, no crime. Santoro will think he ran away." Julian's blood ran cold. "He will find you," Julian whispered. "He will burn this whole city to the ground to find me." "Shut him up," Vane yelled. "Get the gag. Prepare the vat." Scene break, the alleyway. Lorenzo stood in the rain, looking down at the shattered screen of Julian's phone. It was lying in a puddle of mud. The alley was swarming with his men. Black SUVs blocked both ends of the street. Men with assault rifles stood guard, their faces hidden by balaclavas. Marco approached him, holding a tablet. "Boss." "We pulled the security footage from the shop across the street." Lorenzo didn't speak. He just held out his hand. He watched the video on the tablet. He watched the van pull up. He watched the men grab Julian. He watched, and this made his vision go red. He watched one of them strike Julian across the face. Lorenzo handed the tablet back. The glass screen cracked under the pressure of his grip. "Did you get the license plate?" Lorenzo asked. His voice was no longer human. It was a low rumble, like an earthquake before the devastation. "Yes, sir. It's registered to a shell company owned by Jimmy Vane." "Vane." Lorenzo repeated the name. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The scent of rain and ozone filled his nose, but underneath it, he could smell the faint, lingering distress of his mate. Julian had been terrified here. Julian had called for him, and he hadn't been fast enough. Lorenzo opened his eyes. They were pitch black. The Alpha was fully in control now. "Marco," Lorenzo said. "Yes, boss." "Burn Vane's territory. All of it. His clubs, his stash houses, his home. I want his name erased from the history of this city." "And the rescue team?" Lorenzo walked toward his car. He popped the trunk. Inside lay a customized assault rifle and a machete with a silver handle. He picked up the machete. "No rescue team," Lorenzo said, testing the blade's edge against his thumb. A drop of blood welled up. "I'm going alone." "Boss, that's dangerous." Lorenzo turned to look at Marco. The look on his face stopped Marco dead in his tracks. "They have my heart in a cage, Marco," Lorenzo said softly. "I'm not going to rescue him. I'm going to harvest their souls." He slammed the trunk shut. "Get me the location of the van. Now." Tracker puts them at the docks. "Warehouse 4B, Marco said, typing furiously. Lorenzo got into the driver's seat of the Rolls-Royce. He didn't wait for a driver. He revved the engine, the car growling like a beast. Tonight, the Omega named Julian would see exactly why the world feared his husband. Tonight, Lorenzo wasn't a man. He was a calamity. As he sped toward the docks, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, he whispered one promise into the darkness. "Hold on, baby. I'm coming. And God help them when I arrive." End of part 1. Part 2 starts. Scene: the warehouse, inside. The sound of the acid vat bubbling was the only thing filling the silence in the warehouse. It was a sick, rhythmic popping sound, like a heartbeat gone wrong. Julian sat rigid in the metal chair, his wrists bruised from straining against the zip ties. The smell of chemical fumes was making him dizzy, or maybe it was the sheer terror attempting to shut down his system. But he refused to pass out. He focused on the pain in his cheek where Vane had slapped him. He focused on the cold dampness of his clothes. He focused on Lorenzo. Vane was pacing back and forth, his cheap leather shoes squeaking on the concrete. He looked like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Every few seconds, he would glance at the heavy steel doors of the warehouse, then back at Julian, then at his watch. He shouldn't know, Vane muttered to himself, his voice high and thin. There's no way he knows. It's been 40 minutes. Nobody tracks a phone that fast. You don't know him, Julian said softly. His voice was hoarse, but it cut through Vane's rambling. Vane spun around, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. Shut up. Not another word from you. Or I'll cut out your tongue before we dissolve the rest of you. He doesn't need to track the phone, Julian continued, his eyes locking onto Vane's. He feels it. The bond. He knows I'm scared. He knows I'm hurt. And right now, he knows exactly where I am. I said shut up, Vane screamed. He grabbed a heavy wrench from a nearby workbench and raised it, stepping toward Julian. Julian flinched, closing his eyes, bracing for the blow. Boom. The sound wasn't a knock. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of a vehicle, a heavy, armored vehicle, slamming into the corrugated steel of the warehouse entrance at full speed. Metal shrieked and tore like paper. The entire building shook. Dust and rust rained down from the rafters. Vane stumbled, dropping the wrench. What the hell was that? His two henchmen raised their weapons, aiming at the cloud of dust and twisted metal at the entrance. The front of a black Rolls-Royce, its grille mangled but its engine still purring like an angry beast, was visible through the wreckage. The headlights cut through the gloom, two blinding eyes staring them down. Open fire. Vane shrieked. Kill him. Kill whoever is in that car. The henchman unleashed a hail of bullets. Sparks flew as rounds ricocheted off the armored chassis of the car. The windshield spiderwebbed but didn't shatter. The car sat there, immovable, silent amidst the gunfire. Then the shooting stopped. The henchman needed to reload. In that brief, ringing silence, the driver's side door opened. A single leather boot stepped onto the concrete floor. Then another. Lorenzo Santoro emerged from the dust. He wasn't running. He wasn't taking cover. He stood to his full height, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket as if he were walking into a dinner party, not a kill zone. In his right hand, the silver-handled machete glinted under the harsh warehouse lights. He didn't look at the gunman. He didn't look at Vane. His eyes went straight to Julian. For a second, the monster in his eyes softened. He did a quick scan. Julian was alive. Conscious. Tied up. Bruised cheek. That bruise sealed their fate. Lorenzo turned his gaze to Vane. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of burnt ozone and overwhelming, suffocating alpha pheromones. It wasn't just a scent, it was a physical weight. The pressure of a prime alpha forcing lesser men to their knees. You, Lorenzo said. One word. It sounded like a death sentence. Shoot him. Vane screamed, backing away until he hit the railing of the walkway above the acid vat. Why aren't you shooting? The gunman on the left raised his pistol again, his hand trembling violently. He fired. Lorenzo moved. It was impossible for a man that size to move that fast. He was a blur of shadows. He sidestepped the bullet with an almost bored precision and closed the distance in 2 strides. The machete flashed, a silver arc in the dim light. There was a wet thud. The gunman's hand, the one holding the gun, fell to the floor. The man stared at his stump for a second, his brain unable to process the trauma, before he opened his mouth to scream. Lorenzo silenced him with a brutal backhand that knocked him unconscious before he hit the ground. The second gunman panicked. He dropped his weapon and fell to his knees, hands raised. I didn't touch him. I swear. I just drove the van. Please, Mr. Santoro, I have a family. Lorenzo stopped. He looked down at the man begging at his feet. He tilted his head, considering. You drove the van, Lorenzo repeated calmly. Yes. Yes, that's all. So you brought him here, Lorenzo said, his voice terrifyingly gentle. You facilitated this. I was just following orders. Wrong choice, Lorenzo whispered. He didn't use the blade this time. He simply kicked. A savage, calculated strike to the chest that collapsed the man's ribcage. The gunman gasped, choking on air he couldn't inhale, and slumped over, wheezing. Now it was just Vane. Vane was trembling so hard the railing behind him rattled. He fumbled for his own gun, tucked into his waistband, but his fingers were slick with sweat. He managed to pull it out, but before he could aim at Lorenzo, he changed targets. He aimed the gun at Julian. Stop! Vane shrieked, his voice cracking. One more step, and I blow his brains out. I swear to God, Santoro, I'll do it. Back off. Lorenzo stopped. He was 20 feet away. He stood perfectly still, the machete hanging loosely by his side, blood dripping from the tip onto the concrete. Drip, drip, drip. Put the gun down, Jimmy, Lorenzo said. He used Vane's first name. It was intimate. It was mocking. No, you let me walk out of here. Vane yelled, pressing the barrel of the gun against Julian's temple. Julian squeezed his eyes shut. The metal was cold against his skin. He could smell Vane's fear, acrid, sour, pathetic. But beneath that, he could smell Lorenzo. Pine, storm, and safety. Enzo, Julian whispered. I'm here, baby, Lorenzo said, his eyes never leaving Vane's face. Look at me, Jimmy. Look at my eyes. Vane tried to look away, but he couldn't. Lorenzo's gaze was hypnotic. It was the gaze of a predator that knew, with absolute certainty, that it had already won. If you pull that trigger, Lorenzo spoke softly, enunciating every syllable, you will die. But that is the easy part. Before you die, I will find everyone you have ever loved. I will find your mother in her nursing home in Queens. I will find your brother who runs that bakery in the Bronx. And I will make sure they pay for your sin. Vane's breath hitched. You're a monster. I am a husband, Lorenzo corrected. And you are holding my world at gunpoint. Now, I am going to count to 3. If that gun is not on the floor by 3, I will peel the skin from your body while you are still conscious. 1. Vane's hand shook uncontrollably. The gun barrel rattled against Julian's head. 2. Lorenzo took a step forward. Don't! Vane cried, tears streaming down his face. The psychological pressure was too much. The alpha pheromones were crushing his will to fight. He was a low-level thug facing a god of the underworld. THR. Clatter. The gun fell from Vane's hand. He collapsed to his knees, sobbing into his hands. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know. Lorenzo didn't even look at him as he walked past. He moved straight to Julian. The moment Lorenzo was close enough, he dropped the machete. It clanged loudly on the floor, discarded and forgotten. He fell to his knees in front of the chair, his hands that had just maimed men, hovering gently over Julian's face. Julian, Lorenzo breathed, his voice breaking. The monster vanished. The husband remained. Are you hurt? Tell me. Where does it hurt? I'm okay, Julian sobbed, the relief finally breaking his composure. Enzo, I'm okay. Just get me out. Please get me out. Lorenzo reached behind the chair. With a snarl of effort, he didn't bother untying the zip ties. He snapped the plastic with raw, brute strength, freeing Julian's hands. Julian threw himself forward, wrapping his arms around Lorenzo's neck, burying his face in the crook of his shoulder. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with his mate's scent. It was the only thing that could stop the shaking. Lorenzo held him tight, one hand cradling the back of Julian's head, the other pressing him firmly against his chest. He scented Julian frantically, rubbing his cheek against Julian's hair, checking for hidden injuries, re-establishing the claim. I've got you, Lorenzo whispered into his ear, rocking him slightly. I've got you. Nobody touches you again. I promise. I swear on my life. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their breathing and Vane's pathetic sobbing in the background. Finally, Lorenzo pulled back slightly. He cupped Julian's face, his thumbs brushing away the tears. His eyes darkened when he looked closely at the bruise on Julian's cheek. He traced it lightly, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He did this. Lorenzo asked quietly. Julian nodded. The slap. When I wouldn't talk. Lorenzo kissed the bruise. It was a feather-light touch, a contrast to the violence radiating from him. Wait here. Enzo, no. Julian grabbed his wrist. Let's just go. Please. I just want to go home. We will go home, Lorenzo said, standing up. He helped Julian to his feet, keeping an arm wrapped possessively around his waist. But first, I have to take out the trash. He turned to Vane. Vane was curled in a ball, looking up with wide, terrified eyes. You said you implied, if I dropped the gun. I said I wouldn't peel your skin off if you dropped the gun by 3, Lorenzo said coldly. He picked up the gun Vane had dropped. He checked the magazine, then chambered a round. I didn't say you get to live. No, please. I have info. I know who supplied the guns. I know. I don't care, Lorenzo interrupted. You touched him. That is a crime for which there is no currency to pay. Only blood. Lorenzo didn't make a speech. He didn't gloat. He simply raised the gun and fired. Bang. Bang. 2 shots. Both to the kneecaps. Vane screamed, a high, blood-curdling sound that echoed off the metal walls. He rolled on the ground, clutching his shattered legs. I'm not going to kill you yet, Lorenzo said, staring down at him with zero empathy. Marco is 5 minutes away. He has a very special set of tools he wants to show you. You're going to tell him every single thought you've ever had since kindergarten. And when he is done, Then, you have my permission to die. Lorenzo turned his back on the screaming man. He holstered the gun and turned all his attention back to Julian. Can you walk? Lorenzo asked softly. I think so, Julian said, though his legs felt like jelly. Don't bother. Lorenzo swept Julian up into his arms, carrying him bridal style. Julian instinctively wrapped his legs around Lorenzo's waist and his arms around his neck, hiding his face in Lorenzo's chest to block out the sight of the blood and the screaming man. Lorenzo walked out of the warehouse. He stepped over the wreckage of the gate, over the bodies of the men who had made the mistake of their lives. Outside, the rain had stopped. The night air was cool and clean. Sirens were wailing in the distance. Police, or perhaps the fire department responding to the smoke Marco, had started elsewhere in the city as a diversion. A convoy of black SUVs screeched to a halt in front of the warehouse. Marco jumped out of the lead car, flanked by a dozen soldiers. Marco took one look at Lorenzo carrying Julian, saw the blood on Lorenzo's hands, none of it his own, and the destruction behind them. Boss, Marco said, relieved. Is he? He's safe, Lorenzo said. Inside. One dead. One with a crushed chest. Vane is kneecapped. He's all yours, Marco. Marco nodded grimly. Understood. We'll clean it up. The police won't find a thing. Burn it, Lorenzo said as he walked toward the clean SUV Marco had arrived in. Burn it all down. I don't want a trace of this place left standing. He placed Julian gently into the back seat of the SUV, then climbed in beside him, pulling the door shut and sealing them away from the world. Home, Lorenzo ordered the driver. As the car pulled away, Julian leaned his head on Lorenzo's shoulder. His adrenaline was crashing, leaving him exhausted and trembling. Enzo. Yeah, baby. Thank you, Julian whispered, his eyes closing. Lorenzo kissed the top of his head, his hand gripping Julian's thigh tightly, as if he was afraid Julian might disappear if he let go. Sleep, Lorenzo murmured. I'll wake you when we're safe. And tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to buy you the whole damn city, if that's what it takes to make you smile again. Julian drifted off to sleep, lulled by the motion of the car and the heartbeat of the most dangerous man in the world, a heart that beat only for him. But as Julian slept, Lorenzo took out his phone. He looked at the reflection of his own eyes in the dark window. They were still cold, still hungry. Vane was just the beginning. Someone had hired Vane. A low-level thug doesn't target a specific Omega bookstore owner on a whim. Someone had pointed Vane in Julian's direction. Lorenzo typed a message to his intelligence network. Find out who gave Vane the job. I want a name by sunrise. The rescue was over. The war had just begun. End of Part 2. Part 3 starts. Scene, the penthouse bathroom. The water in the massive marble tub was steaming, smelling of lavender and chamomile. It was a stark contrast to the smell of rust and fear that still clung to Julian's skin. Julian sat on the edge of the tub, wrapped in a fluffy white towel, staring at the floor. He hadn't spoken since the car ride. His hands were resting on his knees, and every few seconds they would twitch, a phantom reaction to the zip ties that had bound him hours ago. Lorenzo was on his knees in front of him. The mafia boss, the man who had just crippled a gang and ordered the burning of a warehouse, was currently testing the water temperature with his elbow, his expression one of intense concentration. It's ready, Lorenzo said softly. He looked up at Julian, his dark eyes filled with a heartbreaking gentleness. Come on, baby. Let's get you clean. Julian nodded slowly but didn't move. He felt frozen. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a heavy, crushing exhaustion. Lorenzo didn't push him. He stood up slowly and reached for the towel. May I? Julian nodded again. Lorenzo gently peeled the towel away. He didn't look at Julian with lust. He looked at him like a doctor examining a precious artifact that had been mishandled. His eyes traced every inch of Julian's skin, cataloging the new marks. The purple bruise on his cheek, the red chafing on his wrists, the small scrape on his knee. With every mark he found, Lorenzo's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek, but his touch remained feather-light. He helped Julian into the water. As the warmth enveloped him, Julian let out a long, shaky breath. He closed his eyes. Lorenzo rolled up his dress shirt sleeves, staining the expensive silk with water, and grabbed a sponge. He began to wash Julian's back. I'm sorry, Lorenzo whispered. The sound of the water was the only other noise in the room. Julian opened his eyes, looking at the steam rising. You saved me. Why are you sorry? I was late, Lorenzo said, his voice thick with self-loathing. I let them take you. I let them touch you. I should have burned the whole block the moment you called. Julian turned in the water, reaching out with a wet hand to cup Lorenzo's face. Lorenzo leaned into the touch instantly, closing his eyes, seeking comfort from the very person he was supposed to be comforting. "You came for me," Julian said firmly. "That's all that matters. You came. I will always come for you," Lorenzo vowed, opening his eyes. They were intense, burning with a possessive fire. "From now on, things change. No more working late at the shop alone. No more walking to the car by yourself. I'm doubling your detail." "Enzo," Julian started to protest. He valued his independence. "No," Lorenzo cut him off. "Non-negotiable. I almost lost you tonight, Julian. I felt your fear through the bond. It felt like dying. I am not doing that again." He resumed washing Julian's arm, his touch deliberate. "I'm going to hire a new team. Ghosts. Men you won't even see, but they will be there. And I'm installing a panic room in the bookstore. A real one. Reinforced steel." Julian realized arguing was pointless. Not tonight. Tonight, Lorenzo needed to feel like he was in control, because for 40 minutes in that warehouse, he hadn't been. "Okay," Julian whispered. "Okay, Enzo." Lorenzo kissed Julian's wet hand. "I love you. More than my own life." Scene break. The bedroom. 3 a.m. The penthouse was silent, wrapped in the shadows of the city skyline. But Julian wasn't sleeping. He was tossing and turning in the massive king-sized bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. In his dream, the warehouse was endless. Vane was laughing, but the face kept changing. Sometimes it was Vane, sometimes it was a faceless shadow. The gun was pressed to his temple. Click, click, click. "No!" Julian gasped, bolting upright in bed, his chest heaving, sweat soaking his silk pajamas. "I'm here. I'm here." Lorenzo was there instantly. He hadn't been sleeping. He had been sitting in the armchair in the corner of the room, watching the door, watching the windows, keeping guard like a sentinel. Lorenzo climbed onto the bed and pulled Julian into his lap. Julian buried his face in Lorenzo's chest, sobbing dry, terrified tears. "They're coming back," Julian whispered, the dream still vivid. He said. "Vane said someone pointed me out." Lorenzo stiffened. He stroked Julian's hair, releasing calming alpha pheromones in waves to soothe his mate's distress. "Vane is dead, Julian. He can't hurt anyone ever again, and the men with him are gone." "But he said." Julian pulled back, looking at Lorenzo with wide, fearful eyes. "He said boss said you were pretty. He knew about the shop. He knew my schedule." Lorenzo's eyes went cold, though his voice remained warm. "I know. Marco is handling it. We're going to find out who gave him that intel. And when we do," he let the sentence hang in the air, heavy with a promise of violence. "Don't leave," Julian begged, gripping Lorenzo's shirt. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here." Lorenzo laid them both down, wrapping his heavy arms around Julian, creating a cage of safety. "Close your eyes. Listen to my heart. Nothing gets past me." Julian focused on the steady thump-thump of Lorenzo's heart. Slowly, the terror receded, replaced by the deep, instinctual safety of his alpha. But Lorenzo didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. Vane was a bottom feeder. He didn't have the brains to track Julian's routine. Someone had fed him the information. Someone wanted to hurt Lorenzo by breaking his heart. And that someone was still out there. Scene break. The office, the next morning. Sunlight flooded the penthouse living room, but the curtains in Lorenzo's home office were drawn tight. Lorenzo sat behind his mahogany desk, wearing a fresh suit, but he looked like he hadn't slept in days. On the desk in front of him lay a gun, a glass of scotch, and a burner phone. The door opened, and Marco walked in. He looked grim. He smelled of smoke and bleach, the scent of a cleanup job. "Report," Lorenzo said, not looking up from his glass. "Vane is handled," Marco said. Before he expired, he talked. Lorenzo finally looked up. "And he didn't know the name," Marco admitted. "But he gave us a method. He was contacted via the dark web. An encrypted job posting. Specific target, the owner of the Gilded Page. The job wasn't ransom. It wasn't money. What was the job?" Lorenzo asked, his voice low. The job order was acquire and hold. They wanted Vane to keep Julian alive, but capture him. They were going to pick him up later. Lorenzo slammed his hand onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Someone tried to buy my husband? Like he is cattle." "It gets worse, boss," Marco hesitated, pulling a tablet from his jacket. "We had our tech guys trace the crypto payment Vane received. It was routed through a dozen shell companies, bouncing from Russia to the Cayman Islands. But we found a digital fingerprint at the source." Marco slid the tablet across the desk. Lorenzo looked at the screen. It was a logo, a stylized golden hawk. Lorenzo's blood ran cold. He knew that symbol. It wasn't a gang. It wasn't a street crew. The Valenti syndicate, Lorenzo whispered. We have a truce with the Valentis, Marco said nervously. This is an act of war. If they are targeting Julian, it means the truce is over. Lorenzo stood up, walking to the window. He peeked through the curtain at the city below. The Valenti family ruled the north. They were old money, political connections, untouchable. Or so they thought. Why Julian? Lorenzo asked himself. If they want to fight me, they attack my shipments. They attack my men. Why take my Omega? Leverage, Marco suggested. To force you to concede territory? No, Lorenzo shook his head. Vane said boss said you were pretty. This isn't just business. This is personal. Someone in the Valenti family has an obsession. A memory flashed in Lorenzo's mind. 6 months ago, the gala at the Opera House. Julian had attended with him, one of the few times they went public. Julian had looked breathtaking in a midnight blue suit. Lorenzo remembered seeing Matteo Valenti, the youngest son of the Don, staring too long, staring with a hunger that had made Lorenzo step in front of Julian to block his view. Matteo, Lorenzo growled. The Don's son, Marco asked. He's reckless, but would he start a war over an Omega? He's a spoiled brat who thinks he can take whatever he wants, Lorenzo said, turning back to Marco. He saw Julian. He wanted him. He thought he could hire a lowlife like Vane to snatch him, so his hands would stay clean. If we go after Matteo Valenti, the entire North will come down on us, Marco warned. It will be a bloodbath in the streets. Innocents will get caught in the crossfire. Lorenzo picked up the gun from his desk and checked the safety. Let them come, Lorenzo said. Matteo Valenti tried to steal my husband. He brought war to my doorstep. Now, I am going to bring hell to his. Scene break, the living room. Lorenzo walked out of the office, the mask of the ruthless Don slipping back into place. But when he entered the living room, he stopped. Julian was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, holding a mug of tea. He looked small, fragile. But when Julian looked up, his eyes were clear. The fear from the nightmare was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. You're leaving, Julian said. It wasn't a question. Lorenzo walked over and knelt by the couch. I have to handle business, Julian. Marco stays here, with 6 men outside the door and 2 on the balcony. It's about the Valentis, isn't it? Lorenzo froze. How did you? I heard you yelling, Julian said softly. The walls aren't that thick when you're angry. Julian set the tea down. Matteo Valenti. I remember him from the opera. He cornered me near the bathroom when you were getting drinks. He tried to touch my hair. I didn't tell you because I didn't want a scene. Lorenzo's eyes went black. He touched you. He tried. I walked away. Julian reached out and took Lorenzo's hand. Enzo, if you go after him, it starts a war. People will die. He put a bounty on you, Lorenzo said, his voice trembling with rage. He hired men to hurt you. If I let this slide, he will try again. He won't stop until he has you. I know, Julian said. He took a deep breath. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to be smart. Julian leaned forward, his forehead resting against Lorenzo's. Don't just kill him, Enzo. Destroy him. Make sure everyone knows why. Make sure no one ever dares to look at me again. Lorenzo stared at his husband. He had expected Julian to beg for peace. He had expected the gentle bookseller to ask for mercy. Instead, he found a mafia queen. Julian's Omega instincts were demanding protection, demanding retribution against the threat. A dark smile spread across Lorenzo's face. He kissed Julian deeply, tasting the tea and the resolve on his lips. As you wish, my love, Lorenzo whispered against his mouth. I won't just kill him. I'm going to make an example of him that will be written in history books. Lorenzo stood up, buttoning his jacket. The transformation was complete. The worried husband was gone. The architect of chaos had returned. Marco, Lorenzo roared toward the hallway. Marco appeared instantly. Prepare the car, Lorenzo ordered. We're not going to the office. We're going to the Valenti estate. Sir? Just us. No, Lorenzo said, checking his watch. Call the council. Call the syndicate heads. Tell them I am invoking the blood debt. Tell them Matteo Valenti broke the code. Lorenzo turned back to Julian one last time. Lock the door behind me, Julian. Do not open it for anyone but me. Come back to me, Julian whispered. I always do. Lorenzo walked out of the penthouse. The elevator doors closed, sealing Julian in safety, and sending Lorenzo down into the underworld to burn it all down. The hunt for Matteo Valenti was on. End of Part 3. Part 4 starts. Scene: the Valenti estate, the meeting room. The Valenti estate was a fortress disguised as a mansion. Gold leaf on the ceilings, velvet curtains, and enough armed guards to invade a small country. In the center of the Grand Library sat a long mahogany table. At the head sat Giovanni Valenti, the Lion of the North, an old alpha with gray hair and eyes like flint. To his right sat his son, Matteo Valenti, the man who had tried to buy Julian. Matteo looked smug, swirling brandy in a glass, seemingly unbothered by the fact that he had started a war. The double doors opened. Lorenzo Santoro walked in. He was alone. He wore a black three-piece suit that fit him like armor. He carried no visible weapons. His hands were empty, except for a thin manila folder. Behind him, however, walked three elderly men. The commission, the neutral judges of the underworld. Their presence changed everything. This wasn't a hit, it was a trial. "Lorenzo," Don Giovanni said, his voice gravelly. He didn't stand. "You barge into my home. You threaten my men. You demand a meeting with the commission. This is aggressive behavior for a man who claims to want peace." Lorenzo didn't sit. He stood at the opposite end of the table, his presence filling the room, his alpha pheromones tightly coiled, sharp and suffocatingly cold. "I don't want peace, Giovanni," Lorenzo said calmly. "I want justice." He slid the manila folder down the long table. It stopped perfectly in front of the Don. "Your son," Lorenzo pointed a finger at Matteo, "broke the oldest law we have. He touched an Omega who was already claimed. He hired mercenaries to kidnap my husband." Matteo laughed. It was a nervous, arrogant sound. "Allegedly. You have no proof. Just the word of some dead lowlife thug." "Open the folder," Lorenzo commanded. Giovanni opened it. Inside were printed logs of encrypted chats, bank transfers bearing the Valenti digital seal, and a surveillance photo of Matteo cornering Julian at the Opera House 6 months ago. "The code is clear." Lorenzo's voice dropped an octave, resonating in the chests of everyone in the room. "Omegas are off limits. Trafficking a made man's partner is a declaration of war. I am demanding the blood debt." The three commission members nodded in unison. One of them, an old man named Don Salvo, spoke up. "The evidence is solid, Giovanni. Your son crossed the line. The code demands he be handed over." Matteo stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Dad, are you listening to this? He's bluffing. He's just angry because his little bookstore Omega got scared." Lorenzo moved. He didn't attack. He just took one step forward, and the sheer violence in his eyes made Matteo flinch back. "He wasn't just scared," Lorenzo whispered. "He was bruised. He was bound. He has nightmares because of you." Lorenzo turned his gaze to Giovanni. "Give me the boy. I will make it quick. The Valenti family keeps its territory. The business continues. Only the rod is removed." Giovanni looked at the papers. Then he looked at his son. Matteo was a liability, reckless and stupid. But he was his only son. Giovanni closed the folder. "No," Giovanni said. The room went deadly silent. "Giovanni," Don Salvo warned. "Think about this." "He is my blood," Giovanni snarled, standing up to his full height, his own alpha dominance flaring. "I will not hand my son over to be butchered by this butcher. If Lorenzo wants him, he will have to burn this house down to get him." Matteo grinned, pulling a gold-plated pistol from his jacket. "You hear that, Santoro? Get out, before we bury you in the garden." Lorenzo didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "I thought you might say that," Lorenzo said. He checked his watch. "It's 2 p.m. What does the time matter?" Matteo scoffed. "At 1:55 p.m., Lorenzo said, my hackers released a virus into your family's offshore servers. Your accounts in the Caymans, Switzerland, and Hong Kong have been drained. Every cent. $3 billion gone." Giovanni's face went pale. "What?" "At 1:57 p.m., Lorenzo continued, his voice relentless, my men intercepted your shipment in the harbor. The drugs, the weapons, they are currently burning. You have no product to sell." Matteo's hand shook, the gun wavering. "And at 1:59 p.m., Lorenzo finished, looking straight into Giovanni's eyes, I sent the police the location of your grandfather's burial site. The one where you've been hiding the bodies of the judges you killed in the 90s. The FBI is digging it up right now." Giovanni slumped back into his chair, clutching his chest. His empire, money, product, freedom, had been dismantled in 5 minutes. "You took everything," Giovanni whispered. "I told my husband I would destroy you," Lorenzo said. "I keep my promises." "Kill him," Matteo screamed, raising his gun. "Kill him now." "Matteo, no," Giovanni shouted. But Matteo fired. Bang! The bullet shattered a vase next to Lorenzo's head. Lorenzo didn't flinch. Before Matteo could fire again, the doors burst open. But it wasn't Valenti guards who entered. It was Lorenzo's elite team, wearing Valenti uniforms. "Your head of security works for me now," Lorenzo said simply. "He didn't like that you threatened to kill his family to keep him loyal. I offered him freedom." Lorenzo's men surrounded the table, guns drawn. The commission members sat still, untouched. They knew how this worked. Power had shifted. Lorenzo walked slowly toward Matteo. Matteo tried to fire again, but the gun jammed. He clicked the trigger frantically. Click. Click. "You bought a cheap gun," Lorenzo noted dryly as he reached him. "Fitting." Lorenzo grabbed Matteo by the throat. He lifted him off the ground with one hand. Matteo clawed at Lorenzo's iron grip, his feet kicking in the air, his face turning purple. "Dad!" Matteo choked out. "Help!" Giovanni sat in his chair, a broken man. He looked at his ruined empire, then at the monster holding his son. He couldn't move. He had lost the right to command. "This," Lorenzo said to Matteo, "is for the bruise on Julian's cheek." Lorenzo threw Matteo across the room. The young alpha crashed into a glass display case, shattering it. He groaned, trying to crawl away, bleeding from a dozen cuts. Lorenzo turned to the commission. "I am taking him. The Valenti territory is now Santoro territory. Does anyone object?" Don Salvo looked at Giovanni, who was weeping silently. Then he looked at Lorenzo. "The code was broken. The debt is paid. The north is yours, Don Santoro." Lorenzo walked over to Matteo, who was sobbing on the floor, picking glass out of his hand. "Please," Matteo begged, snot running down his nose. "I'll leave. I'll go to Europe. You'll never see me again." Lorenzo crouched down. "You tried to own him. You treated him like a thing. You don't get to go to Europe. You get to go to the hell you created." Lorenzo signaled his men. "Bag him. Put him in the trunk. I want him alive when we get to the warehouse." "And the father?" Marco asked, stepping forward. Lorenzo looked at Giovanni. The old man was finished. He had no money, no legacy, no heir. "Leave him," Lorenzo said. "Living with the knowledge that his arrogance destroyed his entire family is a worse punishment than death." Lorenzo adjusted his cuffs, turned on his heel, and walked out of the mansion. Scene break. The bookstore, evening. The sign on the door said closed indefinitely, but inside, the lights were warm. Julian was sitting in the back room, surrounded by his favorite books, but he wasn't reading. He was staring at the reinforced steel door Lorenzo had installed that morning. His phone buzzed. A text from Lorenzo. "It's done. I'm coming home." Julian let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 24 hours. 10 minutes later, the secret knock came. Julian unlocked the heavy bolts. Lorenzo stood there. He looked impeccable, not a hair out of place, but Julian could see the exhaustion in the slump of his shoulders. And the smell, beneath the expensive cologne, the scent of violence and gunpowder lingered. "Enzo," Julian whispered. Lorenzo stepped inside and locked the door behind him. He didn't say a word. He just pulled Julian into his arms and buried his face in Julian's neck. He breathed in deep, vanilla and old paper. The scent of peace. "Is he?" Julian asked quietly. "Matteo is gone," Lorenzo said. "He will never hurt anyone again. The Valenti family is no more." Julian pulled back to look at his husband. "And you? Are you okay?" Lorenzo looked at Julian. He reached out and traced the fading bruise on Julian's cheek with his thumb. "I burned an empire today, Julian," Lorenzo admitted, his voice rough. "I took everything from an old man. I acted like a monster." "You acted like a protector," Julian corrected him firmly. He took Lorenzo's hand and kissed the knuckles. "You did what you had to do to keep us safe. I don't see a monster. I see the man who loves me." Lorenzo's eyes softened. The darkness of the day began to recede, chased away by the light of his Omega. "I brought you something," Lorenzo said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. Julian opened it. Inside was a key, an old, ornate iron key. "What is this?" "The key to the Valenti private library," Lorenzo said. "It has first editions from the 17th century, rare manuscripts, things you've only dreamed of seeing. It's yours now, the whole collection." Julian gasped, tears pricking his eyes. Lorenzo had just conquered a crime syndicate, dismantled a dynasty, and likely committed unspeakable acts. And his first thought was to bring Julian books. "You're impossible," Julian laughed, a wet, happy sound. "I'm yours," Lorenzo smiled. They stood there in the quiet bookstore, the world outside still spinning, the criminal underworld in chaos over the power vacuum Lorenzo had created. But in here, there was only silence and love. But as Lorenzo hugged Julian, his eyes opened, staring over Julian's shoulder at the dark street outside the window. Because Lorenzo knew something Julian didn't. When he had seized the Valenti files, he had found something else. Matteo hadn't just been obsessed. He had been funded. There was a silent partner in the trafficking ring. Someone who hadn't been at the meeting. Someone who was now the only loose end left. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to the shadows. End of Part 4. Part 5 starts. Scene: the abandoned shipyard night. The wind howled through the rusted skeletal remains of shipping containers. This was the place where the Santoro family buried its secrets. Matteo Valeni hung suspended by his wrists from a chain in the center of a hollowed-out container. He was barely conscious. His expensive suit was in tatters, and his face was a map of regret. Lorenzo stood in front of him, smoking a cigarette. He looked immaculate, untouched by the grime of the shipyard. Marco stood by the door, holding a tablet that was recording everything. "You have been crying for 3 hours, Matteo," Lorenzo said, his voice bored. "It's becoming tedious. I asked you a simple question." "I told you." Matteo sobbed, blood bubbling on his lips. "I don't know his name. We never met in person." Lorenzo sighed and dropped his cigarette, crushing it under his polished boot. "You expect me to believe that the Valeni family, known for its paranoia, accepted $1 billion in funding from a ghost? You trafficked Omegas for a voice on the phone." "He wasn't just a voice," Matteo gasped. He knew things. He knew about the raids before they happened. He knew about the police investigations. He gave us the routes." Lorenzo stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Who gave you the clearance codes for the shipping lanes?" "Those codes are government-issued." Matteo hesitated. He looked terrified, more terrified of the secret he was keeping than of the man standing in front of him. "If I tell you," Matteo whispered, "he will kill everyone. He's not like you, Santoro. You're a gangster. He's the system." Lorenzo grabbed Matteo's jaw, forcing him to look into his eyes. "Look at me. I just erased your father's empire in an afternoon. Do you really think there is anyone on this earth you should fear more than me?" Matteo trembled. The realization hit him. He was dead either way. "Silas," Matteo whispered. Lorenzo froze. The name hung in the damp air like a curse. "Silas," Lorenzo repeated. "Director Silas? The head of the National Intelligence Oversight." Matteo nodded weakly. "He's the buyer. He doesn't just want money. He collects them. High-profile Omegas. He commissioned Julian specifically. He said Julian was the rare addition he was missing." Lorenzo released Matteo, stepping back as if physical contact with the man disgusted him. Director Silas. The man responsible for monitoring organized crime. The man who supposedly kept the peace. He wasn't catching criminals. He was using them to source victims for his own twisted obsession. And he had the power of the entire federal government behind him. "Marco," Lorenzo said, his voice ice cold. "Boss. Finish it." Lorenzo turned and walked out of the container. Behind him, a single gunshot echoed in the night, ending the Valenti line forever. But Lorenzo didn't flinch. His mind was already racing. Silas had government surveillance. Silas had satellite access. Lorenzo's penthouse, the fortress he had built to protect Julian, was run on a smart security system. A system that was connected to the grid. A grid that Silas controlled. Lorenzo pulled out his phone. "Julian," he whispered. He dialed. The call failed. Network error. He tried Marco's phone. No signal. Lorenzo looked up at the sky. A drone was buzzing silently high above the clouds, jamming the area. "He knows," Lorenzo realized. "He knows I know." He sprinted toward his car. "Marco, drive. We have to get to the penthouse now." Scene break. The penthouse, 9 p.m. Julian was humming softly as he arranged the old books Lorenzo had brought him on the shelves of the library. The penthouse was quiet, peaceful. The city lights twinkled below through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He felt safe here. The door was reinforced. The guards were outside. Enzo was coming home. He picked up his phone to check the time. No service. "That's odd," Julian muttered. He walked over to the landline on the desk. He picked it up. Dead air. A flicker of unease started in his stomach. He walked to the panel on the wall that controlled the smart home system. The lights, the locks, the blinds. The screen was black. "System reboot?" He tapped the screen. Suddenly, the screen lit up. But it wasn't the usual menu. It was a single red eye icon. And then, a voice came through the hidden speakers in the walls. "Hello, Julian." It wasn't a robotic voice. It was a man's voice. Smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly calm. Julian backed away from the wall. "Who is this? Where is Enzo?" "Lorenzo is currently racing across the bridge," the voice said. "He is driving very fast. But I'm afraid traffic control is about to turn all the lights red for him. He won't make it in time." "Who are you?" Julian's voice shook, but he grabbed a heavy brass letter opener from the desk. I am an admirer, the voice Silas said. I have been watching you for a long time, Elias. I prefer Elias. It suits you better than Julian. I watched you at the bookstore. I watched you read. I watched you sleep. Julian felt bile rise in his throat. You're the one. The silent partner. Clever boy. Much smarter than the Valentis. They were blunt instruments. I am a scalpel. Suddenly, the lights in the penthouse went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, lit only by the city glow outside. Then, the sound of the elevator moving. Ding. The elevator shouldn't work without a keycard. But it was moving. It was coming up. I've overridden the lockdown, Silas whispered through the speakers. My recovery team is on their way up. Don't fight them, Elias. You will only bruise yourself, and I hate damaged goods. Julian ran. He didn't run to the bedroom. That was a trap. He ran to Lorenzo's office. He slammed the heavy oak door and locked it. He pushed the heavy mahogany desk against the door. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Think. What did Enzo tell you? If anything ever happens, Lorenzo had said months ago, showing him a hidden panel behind the painting of the stormy sea. Inside here is the God mode switch. It cuts everything. Hard line. Julian scrambled onto a chair and pulled the painting down. Behind it was a safe. He punched in the code, the day they met. The safe opened. Inside wasn't money. It was a heavy lever painted red and a specialized handgun. Julian grabbed the gun. His hands were shaking, but he remembered the lessons Lorenzo had given him at the range. Grip tight. Don't close your eyes. He pulled the red lever. Clunk. The sound of heavy magnetic locks slamming into place echoed through the penthouse. The power cut completely. Not even the emergency lights. The smart system died. The speakers went silent. Julian had just turned the penthouse into a tomb. No one could get in electronically, but they could still break down the door. Crash. The elevator doors were forced open manually in the hallway. Heavy boots on the marble floor. Clear the rooms. A tactical voice shouted. Target is the Omega. Lethal force authorized for anyone else. Julian crouched behind the desk, clutching the gun. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was the husband of the architect. Scene break, the highway. Lorenzo was driving the Rolls-Royce like a madman. He was doing 120 miles per hour, weaving through traffic. Marco, get the chopper in the air. Lorenzo screamed into the satellite phone, the only thing that worked. Airspace is restricted. Marco yelled back from the passenger seat. They declared a no-fly zone over the city 5 minutes ago. It's a federal lockdown. I don't care. Lorenzo roared. Fly it. If they shoot it down, I'll buy a new one. Just get men on that roof. Lorenzo saw the building approaching. It was a dark monolith in the skyline. He could see the lights were out. He cut the power, Lorenzo realized. Julian cut the power. He pulled the lever. Pride and terror roared in his chest. Julian was alive. He was fighting. But he was trapped in a box with a hit squad. Lorenzo drifted the car around the corner, slamming into the curb in front of his building. Police cars were already there, blocking the entrance. Not normal police. Federal agents in tactical gear. Halt! A man with an FBI windbreaker shouted, raising his rifle. This is a crime scene. Federal investigation. Lorenzo didn't stop. He didn't step out with his hands up. He drove the Rolls-Royce through the glass doors of the lobby. Crash. Glass shattered everywhere. The car plowed into the reception desk, crushing it. Lorenzo kicked the door open, stumbling out, his forehead bleeding. He raised his assault rifle and fired into the ceiling. Get out of my way, he screamed, his voice a primal roar that made the federal agents hesitate. That is my husband up there. Anyone who stands between me and that elevator dies tonight. Fire, the agent in charge ordered. The lobby erupted in gunfire. Lorenzo dove behind the marble pillar, Marco providing covering fire. Boss, take the service stairs. Marco yelled, suppressed submachine gun chattering. I'll hold them off. There are 40 flights of stairs. Then you better start running. Lorenzo looked at his loyal friend. Don't die, Marco. Go get him, boss. Lorenzo sprinted for the stairwell door, bullets chipping the stone around his head. He burst into the stairwell and began to climb. He didn't feel his legs burning. He didn't feel the blood running down his face. He only felt the bond. It was screaming. Julian was terrified. Julian was cornered. I'm coming. Hold on. I'm coming. Scene break. The penthouse office. Bam. The office door shuttered. They were using a battering ram. Julian flinched, tears streaming down his face, but he kept the gun pointed at the door. Open up, Elias, a muffled voice said. Mr. Silas just wants to talk. Bam! The wood splintered. The heavy desk slid an inch across the floor. Go to hell, Julian shouted. Flash bang, the voice yelled. Julian scrambled away from the door, covering his ears and squeezing his eyes shut. A canister rolled through the crack in the door. Bang! A blinding white light and a deafening noise filled the room. Even with his eyes closed, Julian was disoriented. His ears rang. He felt sick. The desk was shoved aside. Two men in black tactical gear burst in, laser sights sweeping the darkness. Target acquired, one said. Corner. Behind the chair. Julian raised his gun blindly and fired. Pop. The shot went wild, hitting the ceiling. One of the men moved fast, kicking the gun out of Julian's hand. He grabbed Julian by the hair and slammed him against the wall. Secure him. Get off me. Julian screamed, thrashing, scratching, biting. The soldier pulled out a syringe. Sedative. Night-night, pretty boy. The needle moved toward Julian's neck. Suddenly, the soldier's head exploded. BLAM. Blood sprayed across Julian's face. The soldier dropped dead. Standing in the doorway, chest heaving, suit drenched in sweat and blood, was Lorenzo. He held a smoking Desert Eagle in one hand. He didn't look human. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated so much his eyes looked entirely black. He was breathing in jagged gasps, having run up 40 flights of stairs in 6 minutes. The second soldier spun around. Lorenzo didn't shoot. He dropped the gun and charged. He tackled the soldier through the glass partition of the balcony. They both crashed onto the terrace, wind whipping around them. The soldier was trained. He pulled a knife and slashed Lorenzo's arm. Lorenzo didn't even grunt. He grabbed the soldier's wrist and snapped it with a sickening crack. Then he grabbed the man by the throat and lifted him over the edge of the balcony railing. 40 stories up. Who sent you? Lorenzo roared, holding the man over the abyss. Silas, the man screamed. It was Silas. Please, tell him, Lorenzo whispered, that he just made a mistake. Lorenzo let go. The man screamed all the way down. Lorenzo turned back to the room. He stumbled into the office, his legs finally giving out. He fell to his knees. Enzo! Julian scrambled over to him, ignoring the blood, ignoring the body on the floor. Lorenzo grabbed Julian, pulling him into a bone-crushing hug. He buried his face in Julian's neck, sobbing. Great, heaving sobs of a man who thought he had lost his soul. I'm here, Lorenzo gasped. I'm here. I'm here. You came, Julian cried, holding Lorenzo's face. You ran all the way. I would have run through hell, Lorenzo choked out. Suddenly, the room was filled with red laser dots. Dozens of them, coming from the windows of the building across the street. Snipers. Get down. Lorenzo threw himself over Julian, covering his body with his own. A voice boomed from a megaphone outside, from a helicopter hovering near the window. This is Director Silas. Lorenzo Santoro, you are under arrest for the murder of a federal agent. Surrender the Omega, and you will be taken into custody unharmed. Resist, and we will level the building. Lorenzo looked down at Julian beneath him. They were trapped. Marco was likely pinned downstairs. The police were at the door. The feds were in the sky. And Silas had snipers trained on their heads. There was no way out. Not with guns. Not with money. Lorenzo looked at Julian, and a calm, terrifying resolve settled over his face. Do you trust me? Lorenzo asked. Julian looked into the eyes of the man who had just killed for him. With my life. Lorenzo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black remote. It wasn't for the lights. It wasn't for the TV. Silas wants a show. Lorenzo whispered, thumb hovering over the button. I'll give him a finale. What does that do? Julian asked, trembling. It triggers the failsafe, Lorenzo said. The tunnel. In the foundation. It will blow the support columns in the lobby. The building won't fall, but it will create enough smoke and chaos to cover our escape into the metro lines below. Enzo, if you push that, there's no going back. We lose the penthouse. We lose the business. We become fugitives. Lorenzo kissed Julian. It was a kiss of goodbye to their old life. I don't care about the building, Lorenzo said. My home is right here in my arms. He looked at the helicopter hovering outside. He smirked, and he pressed the button. End of Part 5. Part 6 starts. Scene, the underground tunnels, immediately after Part 5. Dust. Thick, choking dust filled the air. The sound of the explosion was still ringing in their ears, a dull roar that drowned out the world. Lorenzo coughed, waving his hand to clear the air. He was covered in drywall dust, his expensive suit ruined, blood seeping from the knife wound on his arm. But his grip on Julian never wavered. They were in a service tunnel, deep beneath the building's foundation. The blast Lorenzo triggered had collapsed the lobby floor, sealing the entrance to these old metro lines, but leaving the tunnels themselves intact. Julian, Lorenzo rasped, checking him frantically. Are you hurt? Did the debris hit you? Julian shook his head, coughing. He was pale, trembling, but his eyes were wide open. I'm okay. Enzo, the building, our home. It was just a building, Lorenzo said, pulling Julian along the dark track, lighting the way with his phone. Brick and mortar. We can buy another. We can't buy this. He squeezed Julian's hand. They ran for what felt like miles. The air grew colder, damper. Rats scurried in the shadows. Finally, they reached an old maintenance station. Sitting on a rusty bench, wrapping a bandage around his leg, was Marco. He looked like he had gone 10 rounds with a wrecking ball, but he was alive. Boss. Marco grinned through a bloody lip. You certainly know how to make an exit. Marco. Lorenzo breathed out, relief washing over him. Status. The feds are swarming the ruins, Marco reported, standing up with a wince. The news is reporting no survivors yet. Silas thinks he won. He thinks you're buried under 40 stories of luxury condo. Good. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed in the dark. Let him think we're ghosts. It makes it easier to haunt him. Lorenzo sat heavily on the bench, the adrenaline finally fading. The pain in his arm was blinding. He hissed as he tried to move it. Let me, Julian said. He didn't ask. He knelt on the dirty concrete, tearing a strip from his own shirt. He cleaned Lorenzo's wound with the water Marco offered, his hands steady. You're shaking, Lorenzo whispered, looking down at his husband. I'm angry, Julian corrected him. He tied the bandage tight. Silas destroyed our home. He tried to kill us. He thinks he can just walk away because he has a badge. Julian stood up, looking at Marco. The tablet. The one you saved from the office. Does it still have the connection to the external cloud? Marco nodded, surprised. Yeah, but Silas blocked the signals. We can't broadcast. We don't need to broadcast to the public yet, Julian said, his voice cold, sounding terrifyingly like Lorenzo. We need to broadcast to him. We need to lure him out. Lorenzo looked at Julian with awe. The terrified bookseller was gone. In his place was a mafia queen, forged in fire. What is the plan, my love? Lorenzo asked. The Gilded Page, Julian said. My bookstore. It has a panic room you installed, right? But it also has the old PA system that connects to the city emergency grid. It's an old frequency Silas won't be monitoring. You want to go there? Marco asked. It's the first place they'll look. Exactly, Julian smiled. We're going to invite him to a private reading. Scene break. The Gilded Page bookstore, 3 a.m. The bookstore was dark, the rain drumming against the windows. The closed sign was crooked. Inside, the smell of books was now mixed with the scent of damp clothes and high-grade explosives Marco was rigging under the floorboards. Lorenzo sat in the armchair in the back, checking his weapon. He watched Julian moving through the shelves, touching the spines of the books he loved. We have to leave the city after this, Lorenzo said softly. You know that. Even if we kill Silas, the heat will be too much. We have to vanish. I know, Julian said, not turning around. I don't care where we go, Enzo. As long as there are no more guns. No more fear. I promise. Lorenzo stood up and walked to him, wrapping his arms around Julian's waist. An island. Somewhere warm. Just us. Suddenly, the proximity alarm on Marco's tablet beeped. He's here, Marco whispered from the shadows. Black SUV. No backup. Just like the invite said. Lorenzo kissed Julian's neck. Go to the safe room. Lock the door. Do not come out until I say. No, Julian turned. I'm staying. He wants the rare edition. He can look me in the eye when he dies. Lorenzo wanted to argue, but he saw the steel in Julian's gaze. He nodded. Stay behind me. The front door bell chimed. A cheerful little sound that felt grotesque in the tension. Director Silas walked in. He wore a raincoat over his pristine suit. He looked around the dark shop with a sneer. Sentimental, Silas called out. I expected you to run for the border, Lorenzo. But coming back here? To the scene of the crime? Pathetic. Lorenzo stepped out from the shadows of the biography section. He held his gun loosely at his side. Silas, Lorenzo greeted him. You look disappointed. Did you want to find my body in the rubble? I prefer to verify my kills personally, Silas smiled, pulling a sleek, silenced pistol from his coat. And I want the Omega. I have a buyer in Dubai who is paying triple for a widowed Omega. You talk too much, Lorenzo said, taking a step forward. And you have nowhere to run, Silas laughed. I have a sniper across the street aimed at this window. One signal from me, and click. The lights in the bookstore flickered and turned on. Bright, blindingly bright. What? Silas blinked, confused. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the shop. Not Lorenzo's. Julian's. I have a buyer in Dubai who is paying triple. Silas froze. The voice was coming from the speakers. It was a recording of what he had just said. Then, another recording played. Silas's voice from a phone call months ago. Yes, destroy the evidence. Use the Valeni family as scapegoats. I want the trafficking route clear for my personal shipments. Silas's face went pale. He spun around. What is this? Turn it off. Julian stepped out from behind the counter. He held a microphone connected to the old emergency broadcast system. You're live, Director, Julian said, his voice steady. This frequency overrides the local news waves. Every radio, every police scanner, every news station in the city is hearing this right now. You little rat. Silas raised his gun at Julian. Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He didn't monologue. He didn't wait. Bang. Lorenzo shot Silas's hand. The gun flew across the room. Silas screamed, clutching his shattered wrist. Lorenzo walked over to him, calm as death. He kicked Silas in the chest, sending him crashing into a bookshelf. Books rained down on the corrupt official. You thought you were the system, Lorenzo whispered, leaning over him. But you forgot one thing. The system relies on silence. And my husband. Lorenzo looked at Julian with overwhelming pride. He just gave the world a voice. Outside, sirens began to wail. Real police. Not Silas's goons. The broadcast had done its job. The FBI, the press, everyone was coming. You can't kill me, Silas wheezed, bleeding on the floor. I have files. I have leverage. If I die, secrets come out. Your secrets are already uploading to the cloud, Julian said, holding up the tablet. Marco hit send 2 minutes ago. It's over, Silas. Lorenzo placed the barrel of his gun against Silas's forehead. Enzo, Julian called out softly. Lorenzo paused. He looked at Julian. Don't, Julian said. He's over. Let the wolves eat him. Let him go to prison where the men he put away are waiting. Death is too easy. Lorenzo looked at Silas, shivering in fear. Julian was right. Death was a mercy. Being a fallen federal agent in a maximum security prison. That was hell. Lorenzo lowered the gun. He spit on the ground next to Silas. Marco, Lorenzo said. Exit strategy. Way ahead of you, boss, Marco said, opening the back door where a nondescript delivery van was waiting. Lorenzo grabbed Julian's hand. Ready to disappear? Julian looked at the bookstore one last time. His sanctuary. He took the keys from his pocket and tossed them onto Silas's chest. Keep the change, Julian said. They ran out into the rain, jumping into the van just as the flashing lights of the police cars turned the corner. Scene break. 1 year later, somewhere in the Mediterranean. The water was so blue it looked like ink. The sun was hot, smelling of lemons and sea salt. A small white villa sat on the cliffside, overlooking the ocean. There were no guards visible, though if you looked closely at the gardener, you might recognize the lethal efficiency of Marco. On the terrace, a man was setting a table for lunch. He wore linen pants and a loose shirt, his skin tanned, the scar on his arm barely visible now. Lorenzo Santoro looked younger. The weight of the underworld was gone from his shoulders. He placed a vase of fresh lavender on the table. Enzo, you're going to burn the fish. Julian walked out onto the terrace, holding a platter of fruit. He looked healthy, happy. The shadows were gone from his eyes. He wore a silver necklace, no tracker, just a simple ring on a chain. I never burn anything, Lorenzo smirked, pulling Julian into his arms. Except for my enemies. You promised no mafia talk before noon, Julian teased, kissing him. It's 12:01. Lorenzo checked his watch. I love you. I love you too. They stood there, looking out at the horizon. The world believed Lorenzo Santoro and his husband died in a tragic gas explosion in their bookstore a year ago. The architect was a ghost story now. But here, in the sun, Richard, formerly Lorenzo, and Elias, formerly Julian, were just two men who had fought the entire world for each other and won. Julian rested his head on Lorenzo's chest. Do you miss it? The power. Lorenzo tightened his arms around his world. He looked at Julian's smile, felt the steady beat of his heart, and smelled the peace in the air. I have everything I ever wanted right here, Lorenzo said. He kissed Julian's forehead. Lunch is served. The end. And that is the end of the architect's obsession. From a terrified witness in a bookstore to a free man on an island. What a journey. Thank you so much for watching this series. Writing this was a roller coaster. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. And tell me in the comments, Should we do a story about Marco next? I feel like he deserves a romance too. Don't forget to subscribe. New stories are coming every day. Stay daydreaming, and see you in the next video.